作为前的老师嘛，北京时间是19点凌晨7点钟，还没开始。
No need for introduction, but I want to share some influence from well, as well, I was the translator of his recent book, Mechanism, and I also have a class which is about body and architecture, but we particularly have one session on your series, Patrick, because your argument about how parametric system should be taking the responsibility.
Recording in progress.
Architecture to reshape our social network is really important. So in that, so I also bring some of my students here to hear your lecture, because we have a similar topic on this Thursday to talk about the socialized body and influenced by your theory. So it's really a pleasure. And so with no further delay, so please join me and welcome Patrick. Patrick, the stage is yours.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been here a number of times and enjoy also teaching in the international PhD program here. Tonight, I have prepared some remarks, some formal remarks. So I prepared a paper on beauty. So I will read through that. We will take about maybe 45 minutes. And then I hope we can have a discussion. I will not leave the room before we have fully discussed the issues, because we have overall over 2 hours, so which is lovely to have a nice kind of stretch of time together. So yes, and I'm happy you teaching my works, and you're talking about one session. That's surely not enough. But I will come back to Tongji later this year. And I would always love to come here and to have more discussion with you guys. Okay, so beauty, the indispensable category, explained and justified. Start with the abstract. So beauty is the manifestation of aesthetic responses and valuations. Sorry, beauty as the manifestation of aesthetic responses and valuations is a human universal. All societies are having some kind of category of beauty. We all navigate the world aesthetically. Therefore, beauty should be an indispensable category for all design discourses, including architectural discourse. However, beauty is an increasingly embattled and by now nearly extinct category within the conscientious architectural discourse that is rightly aspiring to rational accountability and evidence-based propositions. Beauty has been eliminated from the discipline discourse because it is seen as subjective and irrational, as an irresponsible diversion or distraction from architecture's societal task. However, beauty is clearly not being abandoned by the end users of design, nor are aesthetic choices absent from actual contemporary design practice. It's just no longer talked about. This paper argues that the characterization of beauty as subjective or irrational is fallacious, and that the abandonment of this category is a grave mistake that impoverishes architectural discourse and practice. This paper will justify the category of beauty by explicating the way aesthetic sensibilities and valuations function and contribute to both the life of the end users as well as to the efficiency and success of the designer's effort. The thesis of this paper is thus that aesthetic responses are, more often than not, beneficial life-enhancing responses. By demonstrating this and by identifying the conditions of this functional rationality of beauty, this essay hopes to rehabilitate the category of beauty and integrate it into our conscientious contemporary discourse. The paper will also discuss how to engage both critically and constructively with aesthetic values and sensibilities within the contemporary architectural discourse and practice. So I shall defend beauty against its progressive conscientious detractors by making its rationality and utility explicit, while also defending it against its regressive conservative protectors. So there are those who defend it in a way which I don't find legitimate. So first chapter, the title is The Riddle of Beauty. Beauty seems to be wholly subjective. Beauty is indeed no inherent quality that resides in the object itself. I would not have to restate this truism were it not for the fact that many attempts to defend beauty work with just such a reification of beauty. This attempt to defend beauty by taking it for granted and simply celebrating it will surely backfire. We must rather start with the acknowledgement that beauty is not a substance, but a relation between object and subject. This relation consists, first of all, in individual responses or acts of appreciation and selection. However, this in itself does not make beauty something merely subjective or arbitrary. Neither is it merely an intersubjective convention. The problem is that the act of aesthetic choice happens intuitively, spontaneously, instinctively, without any rational deliberation. This is a problem, but it also has some advantages, as we will see later. Nor are we usually able to rationally account for our aesthetic choices if asked. If asked, we usually say something like, I just like it, or simply, it's beautiful. So in normal discourse, we don't usually have rationalization at play. So contemporary architectural theory and discourse is abandoning, I repeat, the category of beauty because it seems to resist rational accountability and because the concern for beauty seems to run counter to architecture's concern with society's function. The premise of this paper is, however, that aesthetic valuations should indeed be rejected and that's a big if they were merely arbitrary subjective responses. To defend architecture's concern with beauty by simply insisting that rational accountability must be suspended to give the ineffable its due, or because life is more than utility, phrases like this, does not, in my view, constitute a legitimate defense. I also reject the idea that beauty is a pleasure or value in its own right that deserves appreciation and defense and is worth some sacrifices in utility. I don't see it like that. The premise that beauty stands opposed to utility in the sense of an unavoidable trade-off is, although a widespread assumption, in my view, a fundamental fallacy that plagues our discipline. My thesis, in contrast, is, as will be elaborated below, that beauty and utility often enough go hand in hand. My premise is that rational functional probing, explanation and justification should, in the final analysis, indeed be the condition for accepting or rejecting categories and the related human practices. This rationality test, or you could call it functionality test or utility test, must also be guiding architecture's critical self-reflection. There is no other way, in my view, to constitute a credible academic and professional discipline. Therefore, again, if beauty were indeed inherently ineffable, were rationally indefensible, or outright irrational, then it would indeed have to be cast aside. If aesthetic judgments and choices are to count as rational decisions, inverted commas, indirectly with a hidden rationality, I would argue, they must, at least under certain specifiable conditions, be to some extent reproducible. Things are not arbitrary. There's some principle and law governing aesthetic valuations in societies. They're not fail-safe, but they're certainly not arbitrary. That's the key argument. More in general, all my theoretical pursuits are guided by the heuristic principle of function probing, by the quest for functional explanation with respect to all persistent categories and professional practices. This quest for functional explanation also pervades biology and significantly sociology. They're always asking, what are the certain features, certain behaviors, what's their function? Usually there's an evolutionary explanation. And the same in sociology, where you have a lot, and anthropology in particular, where you have a lot of seemingly irrational or inexplicable behaviors. You need to dig deeper to understand what is actually happening here. Maybe there's some underlying functionality, even if it was just a past functionality. That's another point we will get to. So maybe no longer functional, but certainly its emergence was functionally motivated and adaptation. And that is also applying to a lot of what we see happening in a long-standing discipline like architecture. So the same quest for functional explanation might be applied also not only to general practices and categories, but might be applied to the individual features of any particular architectural artifact or designed environment. To be sure, this principle must be understood as heuristic principle, not as a priori axiom claiming that indeed all features are functional, always functional. That's not a claim. Even if they have a specific function, we must not, so if you find a function, we must not therefore presume that they were consciously designed with that function in mind. Often features assume latent or hidden functions unnoticed by end users and unintended by designers also. So one important example, both with individual instances, but also as a general practice. One important example is the semiological functioning of ornament, which I'm claiming, which is often not understood. This misunderstanding about ornament led to the modernist abandonment of ornament, and thereby to the communicative impoverishment of modern architecture. And then later they got this backlash in the postmodernism with the big headline, "Architecture must speak." So the search for functional explanation that go beyond the obvious is a fertile pursuit in all domains that have been subject to a long evolutionary history. And architecture certainly such a field, and you have a lot of evolved rationality. For instance, in the vernacular of this world, there's this whole research paradigm of studying the, for instance, climatic adaptation, passive systems in vernaculars, etc. Even though there was no theory and science of that, it's just empirically happening. So that's an important principle in general, I think, we would like to keep in mind. So my theoretical work here in this paper and in general is guided by what might be termed the pervasive presumption of ultimate rationality or rationalization as a project. That means all of architectural practice without residue should be subject to rational reconstruction, critique, and upgrading. My motivation is not only pure theory, but the agenda of applied theory, the ambition to design and build high-performance environments where, again, all features are functionally motivated. This is, of course, an infinite project. You can't account for everything, but the primary features, you shouldn't just take them for granted and critically probe, etc. And this is important as an ambition within a field like architecture, which has not many actors with a scientific mind, with the proper scientific research, with evidence-based work, etc., but relying a lot on intuitions, on the things we've been always done like this, etc., and etc., etc., and the kind of craft understanding doesn't mean that this craft is, because there's no theory, it all ready to be cast aside, but it certainly needs to be probed and maybe upgraded. In establishing this principle of ultimate rationalization, we must be wary of rationalist hubris in the following sense. So we should give long-standing practices the benefit of the doubt, even if they are not explicitly underpinned by rational argument. We must avoid brushing aside traditional categories and practices too quickly and too impatiently, just because they don't come with ready-made explicit functional justifications, theories, scientific evidence, etc. The mere fact that a category is uncritically taken for granted and practiced in accordance with tradition does not imply that it is to be cast aside as irrational superstition. But this was precisely the mistake of the first phase of the Enlightenment. And this is the mistake of our current bashful abandonment of beauty. It's an example of this kind of mistake, which I call a kind of rationalist hubris. If you don't immediately see the reason, you have to kind of abandon it. No, I'm saying instead you have to kind of probe deeper, because if something survives, persists in the world for so long, it must probably have some underlying rationality, even if it's not explicit. But to make it explicit is very important to justify further reliance on these practices. Okay. Traditions are evolutionary survivors. And therefore, even if prima facie, apparently irrational, deserve at least the benefit of the doubt and some investment in the search for functional explanation. The pervasive fact of relying on aesthetic evaluations, both by end users and by designers, should have alerted our contemporary conscientious architects that they might be missing something. In a different context, Rem Koolhaas formulated this heuristically useful reminder: the persistent pervasiveness of a phenomenon implies that it must mean something. It's one of the phrases from Rem's lectures which are kind of stick in my mind for decades now. And Hegel, German philosopher of the early 19th century, used the memorable dictum, the real is the rational. In his case, this was based on just an observation, if you like. But now we understand why, because of evolutionary processes, what persists as real and reproduces has some underlying survival capacity, therefore rationality, functionality, utility for life. And that goes, for social institutions, political institutions, economic processes, etc., but also architectural ways of working. The real is the rational, but you have to be careful. It's not always like this. It's just a heuristic principle. And it's the same in biology and sociology. There are sometimes dysfunctional patterns, which also survive for a while and persist and linger on. Not everything is, we're not living in the kind of perfect world, which is always perfectly adapted. There's always changes in the environment, and the organisms, they have to make do with what they have and readapt and refunctionalize. So nothing is actually ever perfect. But nothing, but if it wasn't functioning somewhat, it would perish. So that's the kind of thing it's a heuristic principle, a very useful principle way to make scientific progress, to find these underlying rationalities and mechanisms. Okay. The intellectual aspiration should be to query and then, if possible, rationally reconstruct and explain the hidden function and benefit of pervasive practices that are not self-transparent and seem prima facie inexplicable. So this is just the background. So with long-standing cultural practices and traditions, we can usually presume to find some underlying functional rationale. However, uncritical traditional practices display inertia. This means that the practice continues to be reproduced oftentimes, even if the life conditions with respect to which the practice in question represents a functional adaptation might have disappeared. These practices can persist if there's no other group, other practice, competitive, which could outdo, and they don't necessarily spring up out of nothing. So you could have a lot of opportunities building up, but inertia persists because there's no competitive challenge. So the cultural practice has then lost its functional justification and runs idle. It might be comparable to rudiments we find in organisms. You always have to evolve with what you've got. Everything is not perfect, but it could be grammatically, interestingly, new functions. So, for instance, these were feet at one point, and kind of the eating organs, teeth, mouth, tongue, they're now speech organs. So, but that means they're not perfectly, designed artifacts. But oftentimes you can't do better as designers. They like the eye is one of the examples, super well adapted. Okay. So as an example of, let's say, some practice which used to have a strong functional motivation, and that might have been lost, but it lingers on. There's also an example which has something to do with the realm of aesthetics, sense of beauty. So as example, we might cite the practice of transmitting epic stories via highly formalized and structured speech involving rhythm, rhyme, and meter, so kind of poetic forms of speech. And I wonder if you have that probably in China too. As we can find in ancient epics and dramas. So in ancient Greece, the main epics, they all have, they're constructed like poetic speech, and the dramas, but also in many later works of European literature, all the way to the 19th century. For example, Goethe's Faust, one of the great German plays of the early 19th century. So the functional rationale of this phenomenon and practice is mnemotechnical. So it's kind of memory technique in oral cultures, right? So, and the stabilization of oral reproduction and transmission of important societal messages founding myth epics. Especially important in pre-literary and to some extent also in literary civilizations prior to printing. So literacy was not very widespread. And my parents still kind of had to memorize, long poems, and you still in China, you use all these idioms and stuff. And for that, this meter, rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, all of these techniques of poetry, they're highly functioning because you wouldn't be able to remember and transmit. You would have so many copy errors that nothing would survive. So that's the kind of functional explanation I'm always looking for. But however, you could say that in the 19th century, printing for several hundred years, and you had libraries, and certainly the 20th century, with respect, it made no much sense to, and now it becomes it has disadvantages too, because it's very kind of indigestible to some extent. The whole play of in rhyme and rhythm and meter and so on, like Faust. Okay, so I think they lingered on for about, it's like a few hundred years too long. And certainly now finally also has disappeared in Europe. It finally, it will also, these things will disappear eventually. But when you might encounter them, there might already be dysfunctional or no longer functioning so much, but they're still going to be kind of, they exert a cost, and they linger on for too long. So you have to be wary of that. That's as an example. So thus here we have a functionally grounded practice that might seem to be motivated by an inexplicable investment in beauty, poet, this kind of rhyme and so on the one hand. So that's good as an example, but also one that has lingered on beyond its functional necessity for too long. All right. So you can already start to maybe get some hint of the solution I'm going for the riddle of beauty, in terms of some examples of underlying rationalities. So my core argument there is shared aesthetic responses, criteria, ideals of beauty have the function, not the conscious purpose, but the function, to discriminate the beneficial from the detrimental. You'll get to realize this, and I hope you'll see if you agree to that. How is this achieved? So there are often systematic, though not fail-safe, external clues of an entity's functionally relevant capacities. And there are processes of cultural evolution as well as individual learning mechanisms that form well-adapted aesthetic sensibilities, where the outward appearances of something beneficial, you later on just, that's enough for you to get the positive response. So the function of aesthetic sensibilities is latent rather than manifest. In evolutionary theory, the concept of function is applied to a feature mechanism of behavior if its effect contributes to its reproduction. So if it is a beneficial effect, you keep following these sensibilities and rely on them, because they, more than often than not, guide you well. And that means if positive effects, they kind of then keep selecting them, keep reproducing them. And that's called the selected effect theory of functions. What is a function? So although not reducible to these, the appreciation of beauty and aesthetic judgment is connected with such conditioned gut reactions, delivering an instant intuitive discrimination of the beneficial. Okay. My thesis is that our sense of beauty, our being drawn towards the beautiful, is nothing but our animalistic, intuitive way to recognize and choose the useful. This is the underlying rationality of beauty, the solution of the riddle of beauty. So to cast this into a succinct formula, beauty is the outward appearance of utility, which we can kind of, like a pattern recognition, pick up instantly and react positively instantly, or react negatively, attraction or repulsion. But we do that because we You're recognizing what's good, what versus what's detriment. Here is an example that also exemplifies the conditions and limitations within which beauty signifies utility. So as example may serve here the classical ideal of architectural beauty that originated in ancient Greece and Rome, to be picked up again in the Renaissance and once more in the 19th century neoclassical architecture. So it's the classical system of proportions and symmetry, by the way, as well. Classical system of proportions and the classical orders. That is the proportions, the ratio of column height to intercolumn, the spacing, and column widths. So they're fixed ratios. The vertical shape of windows, the fact that windows are pulled away from the building corners because there's pressure through the arching to the side, which needs to be taken up. You can't make long spans. And so, yeah. So these features are all structurally sensible under the premise of masonry construction and are determined by experience and finally conventionalized or canonized into a rule system and an ideal of beauty that allows both designers and end users to visually and intuitively identify the structurally sound construction. The same applies to details like column bases, capitals, arches, etc., as well as the imposition of overall symmetry. Now, in Alberti, they're talking about these system of proportions like representing the cosmic order. It's a kind of very non-pragmatic, mystified justification. If you read Alberti, you get, he's much more hands-on, and you get a sense that this is practically motivated ultimately. So in Alberti, for instance, you can pick that up. So also the overall imposition of symmetry. The latter is not only symbolizing the integrity of the structure, but indeed structurally called for to balance weights and thereby to avoid cracks due to the uneven settlement of foundations. And, it only with Philip Bloch and Reinhold you can actually balance asymmetric conditions, or when engineering started with calculations, calculating forces, and you can make the foundations proportionate to the load, you can actually do asymmetric loadings. So therefore the symmetry and also proportion, and Alberti also goes further in proportioning the height of the rooms with their size and the amount of people, and that you can argue is also makes sense with respect to air volume, etc. Anyway, so that is an example of an ideal of beauty which has technical underpinnings and a very highly pragmatic relevant, also in terms of reproducing something predictable and etc. And then you recognize that and you see this is a reliable building. I'm happy to live and enter and join this. So a composition that violates these rules would look, for those socialized into this ideal of beauty, would look ugly and thereby would be rejected. And rightly so, because it would in the end kind of signal unreliability. So, but then of course we have the shift from masonry to steel and concrete construction, which undermined the rationale or the rationality of the classical way of composing. And in a way, with neoclassical recursion of that, it was already kind of no longer really called for, because you had concrete and steel at hand in the 19th century. But the classical orders lingered on another 100 years, let's say. So So the shift from masonry to steel and concrete construction undermined the rationale of the classical way of composing. It had become a meaningless formalism. And finally, 100 years into it, the modernists called this out. Rejection of the styles, etc., etc. So the aesthetic revolution initiated by Art Nouveau and Expressionism and finally delivered by the heroes of modernism in the 1920s, finally, in a by then long overdue coup de grace, spelled the end of classical beauty and the beginning of the modernist ideal, as canonized, for instance, 10 years later, the early 1930s, by Hitchcock, Russell, and Philip Johnson in the international style, where they spell out explicitly a lot of the new aesthetic principles of composition, let's say. And you have, you know, stretched proportions, asymmetric compositions, etc. Seriality, endless repetition, and there were some underlying rationalities out of the industrial kind of scientific engineering, calculated engineering plus industrial production. Makes sense and makes this this new style and ideal of beauty more well adapted to conditions of an industrialized society. 100 years too late, let's say. But then again, 50 years later, this ideal disintegrated once more, and finally, 20 years further, after 20 further years of experimentation through postmodernism and deconstructivism, a new system of principles emerged, soon to be christened, named and canonized as parametricism. So parametricism is the contemporary epochal style, which is making modernist work pragmatically, functionally irrational, very wasteful, because they can't integrate sophisticated contemporary structural logics. You never just do an extruded beam. You have moment lines. You have many, you know, more intricate moves and compositions. And so, but this lingers on, of course. Modernism and minimalism is still lingering on for another, 30, 40 years. Okay. So step back and continue more the theoretical text. So aesthetic responses stand in a continuity with the most basic discriminatory response mechanisms of attraction versus repulsion we find in all mobile organisms as a basic survival mechanism. Right? It's very deep. It's just basic survival. Move towards nutrition, move away from, detrimental temperatures, moving up the nutrition gradient. Bacteria already have that. And that's still connected up with, oh, I won't go here. This is not good for me. So with respect to human life, it is helpful to point out our gut reactions to attractive and repulsive, for instance, smells and tastes. Because at this basic visceral level, the functionality of the response in terms of approaching the beneficial and avoiding the detrimental is rather obvious and unproblematic. So it's a good paradigm case. Even the seemingly most disinterested, elevated, culturally refined aesthetic judgment stands, or at least in my view should stand, in a fundamental continuity with the basic attraction versus repulsion mechanism, lest it runs idle, having disconnected with all distinction of the beneficial versus detrimental. If there are such aesthetic judgments, maybe we should, which are purely kind of disconnected from anything, we should kind of criticize them or not play along with some idle game. That's my view. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's kind of highly sophisticated, artificialized connoisseurship. So the concept of taste, in terms of cultural taste, aesthetic taste, architectural taste, is a useful linguistic trace of this continuity I'm claiming, to the very basic paradigm, for instance, of smells and tastes in food. While the latter case of refined aesthetic judgment does exist in a highly rarefied condition of connoisseurship, it has little significance in the life of society, or for that matter, within architectural discourse and within the life addressed and framed by architecture. To the extent that untethered connoisseurship does exist within architectural culture, I'm rather critical of its influence. Anyway, we can just discuss this further. So there is this phenomenon, and I think that is kind of irresponsible if it just sort of plays along with disconnected from what is identifying the beneficial versus the detriment. It's perhaps meaningless. So the rationality of aesthetic responses involves two aspects: the aspect of recognition and the aspect of action motivation. That is perceptual cognitive rationality or discrimination, and evaluative motivational rationality or attraction comes along with it. So let's consider once more the pervasive human practice of ornamentation alluded to above. It seems as if its purpose is to beautify for the sake of aesthetic delight as an end in itself. However, ornamentation is a human universal. That is, there are no human societies in which ornamentation, including the ornamentation of the human body itself, as well as all its instruments, clothes, and buildings, everything, always ornamented. So there's no human societies in which ornamentation, including the ornamentation of the body itself, is not pervasive, and indeed absorbs a significant amount of resources, also in otherwise extremely poor societies. You find it in the most, in anthropology, in very primitive tribal cultures. They're doing enormous amount of work on their external bodies, on ornamenting the instrument, their environments, their clothing, the highly kind of, and it is immensely costly. And if it wasn't a life necessity, one wouldn't see such phenomena. Okay, that's an important thing. And still to this day, the amount we're spending on fashion and makeup and a lot of signaling and and extra details on architectural artifacts to distinguish architectural engineering structures, which are not to be looked at, which are hidden, which are in basement and so on. The difference is enormous. And why are we doing this? Oh, we like it. Well, that's not good enough. So from this fact of this pervasive, universal, massive investment, we must conclude. So from this, we can draw the conclusion that human society cannot function without ornamentation of all these kinds. No human group could have survived if it had just wasted such huge efforts on useless things. Instead, only those who invested in developing, in fact, systems of ornamentation survive, because there's no group without it. And this is why you can construct an argument that there's a kind of there must be functionality to it. You can make a similar argument of the functionality of religion to some extent, which is a human universal too. And there are, of course, sociology of religion debates. And that doesn't mean that it might also exist for too long and there are substitutes now, etc. So this means that ornamentation is indispensable for human survival and flourishing. The explanation here, why is that so, is that human societies, compared to primates, which are a group of 25 chimpanzees, they can be naked in a kind of unstructured environment. But human society is always much larger, hundreds at least. And then they're structured, they grow into larger groups. So how do you identify and structure and order that? We recognize social roles, or we recognize places for different activities to structure kind of integrated cooperative life, which is the human life. And for that, you just need these, let's say, markings and conspicuous distinctions, etc. And that's why I talk so much about the semiological project. But then also when people engage with this, they just know that. They just have to dress up like this and do this to feel good, and somebody isn't, he's rejected. It's kind of an aberration, is some kind of monster. If you come naked or whatever, if you walk naked, you're a monster. And ugly, possibly. Anyway, so the explanation here is that human societies, compared to primates, which don't have ornamentation, are increasingly large, differentiated, cooperative, productive organizations that can only function if both the different social spaces and the social roles are legibly and conspicuously marked and distinguished. And therefore, the designed environments and fashion systems deliver the semiological system necessary to sustain the division of labor and the social order of society. The concept of semiology points us to the recognition aspect, the concept of beauty and the aesthetic sensibility, sustaining it, which here also includes the sense of propriety, points also beyond recognition to the required motivating emotional investment. So they become fetishes here. They become necessities, emotional necessities also. So that's why you need that motivation, that element, which is inbuilt in the aesthetic judgment. So the evolution of the general mechanism and practice of aesthetic valuation and choices goes deep into biological genetic evolution, but also evolved further through a long cultural evolution. In biological evolution, you have things like you appreciate a strong, healthy, symmetrical body, a young kind of person, etc. But in cultural evolution, you have many different and diverse ideals of beauty. So the evolutionary emergence of particular ideals of beauty has partly also genetically sustained components or aspects, while being largely driven and differentiated by cultural evolution, especially in the realm of the built environment and architecture, of course. Cultural traditions are transmitted via socialization processes. However, individual learning based on direct experiences also shape individual sensibilities and tastes by way of conditioning. So there could emerge some kind of individual variations and sensibilities. There are some cultural sensibilities which are universal in a whole society, but then different in the division of labor, different subgroupings, subcultures. They develop subsidiary aesthetic sensibilities, and it's also moral sensibilities are very similar. What kind of behavior you find acceptable and appeals to you and so on is very similar. They obviously then they're also related to different functional roles, these groups and strata, and their conditions of success get condensed into aesthetic. So it's not necessarily in simple societies, it's more universal. In complex societies, you could have, have kind of proletarian tastes and then the taste of the educated and so on differently, etc., etc. So that is to be recognized. That doesn't mean to make it arbitrary and subjective. It's still functional to the particular functional requirements of certain groups using certain spaces, etc. But I think there's also universal things going on across all societies. So okay. So the idea of beauty's dependence on utility, to some extent, not in that full explicitness and explanation, but to some extent that was understood and was some kind of staple theorem of the modern movement. They said things like, you don't pursue beauty directly, so rejecting all what the instincts you had, and you go this radical function, you go scientifically and functionally. But then they claimed the outcome is beautiful. And you can do that, and you can kind of promote that and say this. These are the aesthetic revolutions then also. So that's the way I thought about it. And radical functionalism was, because you don't know what you should love and understand as so beautiful. You have to discover the forms, the functional forms you now should fall in love with, and then don't have to go through this calculation and scientific every time. You can then kind of go back to liking it. If you disseminate it, not everybody has to understand why they should like it. They don't know, like, now we should like this. So the modern movement, and it could also be found in earlier figures like Gottfried Semper and Pugin in the arts and crafts movement. There were some anticipations of this. So it's not a brand new insight here. And the understanding of beauty's crucial connection to performance, while mostly ignored or forgotten or misunderstood, is not new, but has rather ancient precursors. Several times this was kind of articulated. So the central insight we find in David Hume's Treatise on Human Nature, which is, from the 18th century, and where he quotes a paragraph from Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, which is a kind of Latin, ancient Roman author, that already clearly expresses the core insight. So this is now David Hume quoting Quintilian. An athlete whose muscles have been developed by training presents a handsome appearance. He is also better prepared for the contest. And then comes the generalization. Attractive appearance is invariably associated with efficient functioning. So that is Quintilian. Of course, the critical element is missing here is that necessity of recurrent historical updating. And of course, later on, there were other ideas of beauty. Fat man was very attractive because it kind of signaled wealth and the ability to kind of nourish. And he didn't have to fight. He had others to fight for. So there's a kind of historical component to it. And kind of now we have, you can now see, if you look at ideals, human figure ideals of beauty that have been changing, the athletic one is kind of now come kind of back to some extent. But also it's dependent on which social group you're looking at. All right, so this insight has been around and I'm fine with that. I don't have to be, I picked it up from somewhere too. So the next chapter is called The Universality of the Category of Beauty and the Historical Relativity of Particular Ideals of Beauty. So here is how I explained beauty in an article from 2001. So I was onto this for over 20 years in the context of architecture and urban design. So I'm quoting my old article. The aesthetic judgment of cities and buildings is rational in as much as it operates as an immediate intuitive appreciation of performativity, short-circuiting first-hand comparative experience or extended analysis. Aesthetic judgment thus represents an economical substitute for experience. It depends on tradition that disseminates accumulated experience via dogmatic rules. This dogmatism is the virtue as well as the limit of aesthetically condensed experience. The virtue of this reduction to dogma is cognitive economy, stability and easy transmissibility. Its limitation is inertia in the face of rapid transformation in the conditions of life. The condition of beauty's proper functioning is thus a certain stability of life conditions, so that there is enough time for well-adapted morphologies to evolve and enough time, moreover, for respectively well-attuned aesthetic sensibilities to stabilize. These are two conditions which are usually have been present, and usually in history it changed. It took 100 years until something really had to change. In recent years, it's more in decades rather than centuries, but still, it still, I think, works, and we need to rely on this, but critically probe also what we want to rely on. So when technological and social life conditions change, then high-performance urban morphologies change also, usually not often by design, sometimes by mavericks and by people ignoring the architectural canons and just doing stuff. And therefore, aesthetic responses should and will, in the end, change too. So I quote again from an article from that period. With the development of society, what once was an accumulated wisdom becomes an irrational prejudice that has to be battled on the ideological plane of aesthetic value. Then you have debates about beauty, or you have revolutionaries who claim the revaluation of our values, like Nietzsche in the moral realm, where they declare what used to be beautiful horribly ugly, like the modernists declared traditional ornamented classical monstrosities, and what would have been looked at as being ugly. So the ugly becomes beautiful and the beautiful becomes ugly. In these periods of revolutionary transformation, and you have these, let's say, battle around aesthetic value. Such a battle was waged and won by the heroes of modern functionalism. The technological and social revolutions called for an aesthetic revolution, establishing and aestheticizing non-classical proportions, asymmetry, seriality. So the anthropological and historical evidence that ideals of beauty are malleable and culturally evolved is clear. I mean, there's thousands of examples. Thus, while the category of beauty is a human universal, no particular ideals or aesthetic sensibilities are universal. Like good versus bad, the distinction beautiful versus ugly is a rather general, highly abstract, evaluative distinction, just like, don't like, or discrimination mechanism that can be implemented or concretized by diverse sets of criteria. To become operational, beauty requires historically evolving specifications. Not every year, perhaps not even every decade, but certainly in times of rapid historical transformation. So this abstract binary has to be filled with concrete specifications. And also you can just train by examples, like an AI system. But oftentimes it's very useful to not only be trained and be looking at 100 examples of something beautiful, 100 examples of something ugly. That's the way usually we learn. And then you get some new examples and you say ugly, beautiful. And you have no conception. But usually, and architectural theory has often delivered more. They kind of bring more features and criteria which help you to more fail-safe. And also, particularly as a designer, you want to build it, you can't just randomly do stuff. Is it ugly, 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 ugly? There are some kind of principles and recipes, features, so analytically break down what can deliver beautiful. So that is then the role of architectural theory. So these sets of criteria. And you can find them, as I said, in International Style. You can find them in Le Corbusier. You can find them in my works. So I've done that as well as something like Charles Jencks was the language of postmodern architecture. You have these kind of canonizers, and they usually come late after this has evolved already. It's very difficult to invent that. It has to evolve. It has to happen in usually 10, 15 years, at least later, that you then look at all the examples and say, okay, this is the principle. This is the way we can kind of, canonize it and identify it and learn and teach that, not just by example. But a lot of people just learn by example. It's trained like dogs. That's why we learn most things. It's kind of a form of conditioning. So to become operational, beauty requires historically evolving specifications, etc. All right. So the critical, last chapter, I guess, the critical constructive engagement with aesthetic regimes and sensibilities. As rational, self-critical, self-determining agents, we should not indulge in our aesthetic predilections as something unchangeably given, as something to satisfy without question. You just say something like, well, I simply like this kind of things, or I don't like these kind of spaces. And like, you shouldn't, maybe you are liking all the wrong things, which hamper you, which block your development. You always run to the wrong places where nothing happens. So you're totally nostalgic and you cut off. You're not vital, you're not productive. You always like the wrong women who are never good for you. You have all sorts of false aesthetic sensibilities, and you like the wrong architecture, which is really not working well. That obviously could happen, because we've moved so fast, the society changes so fast, so we have to critically probe and question. I also have some of these kind of I'm a sucker for certain minimalist things, but I know I have to battle that and avoid them. So we cannot blindly trust our aesthetic sensibilities. Instead, we should probe and query our aesthetic values, and if found maladapted, update them or revolutionize them. Thereafter, we can go back to rely on them. Indeed, we cannot avoid relying on some of these aesthetic sensibilities. Without the cognitive shortcut afforded by aesthetic sensibilities, we would not be able to navigate or cope with the world. Analytically, always kind of calculate and analyze. You have to act intuitively, of course. What applies to us as end users of designed environments also applies to us as designers, moving rapidly and intuitively through myriads of design decisions. There's so many design decisions when you work on a project. You have to rely on intuitive sensibilities, and they have to be the right ones. Otherwise, So here too, we must rely on the cognitive shortcuts afforded by our aesthetic intuitions and sensibilities. Thinking fast versus thinking slow. So you need a period of thinking slow, of analytic, to verify and probe and in a debate discuss book-length treatises to confirm and defend. And then when you're sure, you can kind of then say, okay, that's what we need to go by. That's what we can then kind of rely on that. And simply say things, never use Platonic forms, simple forms, which we never used. The interesting thing is that what I realized when I wrote about pragmatism, that in DRL and elsewhere in the firm, we had maybe 15 years in, we had never drawn a repetitive grid, never drawn a circle, triangle, cube, never, and always doing other things we need to start. So we kind of recognize what you're doing. And it seems kind of fetishistic, but maybe not. Maybe you can rationalize it and then double down on doing that. And be very confident in instantly different. No, this project, no. It can't be a good solution. It's reductive. It's would have been the best solution 80 years ago. Now it cannot be. Simply cannot. Okay, so beauty is very abstract, empty, but historically programmable and reprogrammable category. This allows the category itself to be resilient and ultra-stable. So the category itself will always be there. It's because it's so abstract. It always reprogrammed, but we need it. The programs that in each socioeconomic epoch specify the particular operational criteria of beauty are the epochal styles or the aesthetic regimes of those epochal styles. Architecture responded to and participated in the transformation from the 19th century laissez-faire capitalism to 20th century Fordism via the transition from 19th century historicism to 20th century modernism, for instance. Currently, architecture is, or rather should be, responding to and participating in the transformation from 20th century Fordism, just mechanical mass production systems, to our 21st century post-Fordist network society via the paradigm shift from modernism to the new epochal style of parametrism. So parametrism is, I think, that style, and I would include everything which is well adapted to these conditions. First of all, the changes in the environment, that we have a knowledge economy, that we have highly diversified roles and division of labor and very fluid and dynamic ways of collaborating, and also using all these new technologies to communicate with each other, but also to build. And, you know, new kind of engineering feedback, but also the social functionality and technical functionality, they're all radically transformed in that kind of computational age. And parametrism is simply, and I've so far canonized it. And I can present it as a new dogma if you like, but if you prove to me there's something different and other ways could also feed in and be well adapted and congenial to this societal life at the frontier, of course, in backward areas where life is still like 200 years ago, 100 years ago. Of course, that is not I'm talking at the frontier of civilization. You know, it's that open, and whatever it is, so far I've defined it this way in parametrism, tectonism, but I want to bring into this category of parametrism everything which is well adapted to this contemporary condition. So this transition from modernism to parametrism, and there has been some in between, like, you know, postmodernism, deconstructism, short interludes where they discovered some aspects, but in the end weren't the solution. They were very short, 10 years of postmodernism, 10 years of deconstructivism, but now 30 years of parametrism. So that's the real thing. This transition, this once more implies a revolution in the discipline and society's aesthetic values and ideal of architectural beauty, but also include all the design disciplines. You know, so a Ross Lovegrove in industrial design, for instance, or also in fashion design, I think, which should and would, you know, differentiated fabrics and hyper adaptive. So that's this kind of new emerging ideal of beauty. I have specified these new aesthetic values of parametrism in volume 2 of my book, The Autopsychology of Architecture. A more elaborate presentation of my theory of beauty can also be found in volume 1, section 3.8, The Rationality of Aesthetic Values. The thesis in that book relating to this, thesis 17, reads, aesthetic values encapsulate condensed collective experiences within useful dogmas. Oops, deliberately using that kind of slightly provocative term. Their inherent inertia implies that they progress by revolution rather than evolution. because they're not, you keep doing them until you can't, until you have to change. It's not something you ask every day, is it still the best? So the theme of beauty is then picked up again in volume 2, chapter 8.63, Beauty and the Evolution of Concepts of Order. So I can point you to those writings. So there is, at the moment anyway, no substitute for the aesthetic navigation of the world, which thus should not and indeed cannot be eradicated. At least not, and that's kind of speculation, until AI systems substitute for our fast operating, but slowly updating aesthetic sensibilities. Maybe. Maybe you get some kind of fast operating and fast adapting capacity through some kind of AI empowerment. I don't know. But certainly not yet. So the same applies to design practice. Here too, at the moment, no substitute for well-adapted aesthetic sensibilities as guides to make rapid intuitive design decisions or choices when confronted with the increasing abundance also of AI-generated options. If you look at 1,000 options, how do you select? Like, don't like. Parametricism, more tectonism, it fits more. No, whatever. So there's no substitute. We gotta get this right and rely on it. While though more and more computational analysis and optimization tools become available that empower and further rationalize the design process, these two tools each address only a single partial aspect of the overall increasingly complex multi-object task. So that helps a lot. It generates more the option, but then you still select. Even if the designer, and we as designers, we are all kind of a wet computing neural network, can reduce or eventually eliminate his or her reliance on aesthetic, intuitive, non-discursive, non-analytic choices. It's a big if. Through these tools, let's say, and you don't make choices, you always feed them through recognition systems, etc. But then you have to construct the right ones. It's a big if. Then architects will still have to anticipate or reckon with and steer the ineliminable aesthetic discrimination of the end users. Also have to. So I think this category will be around. So therefore, architectural discourse is, on more than one count, deficient if it ignores the operation and function of our sense of beauty and aesthetic values. How then should architectural discourse engage with beauty? My answer, and I hinted at it already, by first trying to make the aesthetic values underlying our operational sensibilities explicit, then by subjecting them to critical comparative evaluation, and if necessary, by positing new values and explain those with respect to their functional rationality in connection with general salient aspects of the contemporary life process. In my writings, this has taken the form of concisely formulating the formal aesthetic heuristics, both positive and negative heuristics of parametricism. To show that these new formal principles are congenial with current societal life process requirements, I have paired up the formal heuristics with the complementary functional heuristics that guide or should guide our contemporary understanding of architectural explicit functional programmatic sides. So I think every new style has not only some formal heuristics, but you'll see here how when I name them, also some kind of particular understanding of programs and tasks and the social functionality of buildings. We have different categories than the modernist have. We don't have just, schedule of accommodation with some stereotypical labels, which have certainly, and we have something slightly different understanding. So negative and formal heuristics, I've now paired them up with the negative functional heuristics. So first, no pure Platonic forms. And as I just said, we've never drawn one for the last 30 years. And that I link that up with no fixed stereotypes in the kind of domain of function and program. No simple repetition. You always iterate and vary and have gradations and gradients, etc. Not endless repeating the same. And that means on the functional side, when we understand society and institutions, no social simple standards or homogenization or simple repetition. You know, if you do a class, you know, a house, 1,000 of the same apartment. No, not really. And then, but also no collage of unrelated entities, which we saw the first response post-modern deconstructivism. And we don't just juxtapose things. We have no kind of segregative zoning, for instance, where things remain separate and distinct and unrelated. So that's negatively. And it's important to basically stop what attaches to the old paradigm and try to only work with a new paradigm, not kind of compromise. Particularly in an innovative, in a research project, you have to be kind of, you want to test the new paradigm, don't fall back, don't lapse back. So that's why it's important to have these negatives, these prohibitions. Positively, positive formularistics paired with the positive functionalistics. So all forms are parametric, parametrically malleable. So you have to set up every element, every form as parameters and variations and so on. And that means all functions you think of, they are variable event scenarios. They all come with parameters as well. It's not just the classroom. It's always this thing, 30. Then the next one is all systems. So you have many elements come together. They are differentiated. So it's kind of repetition. But also all program domains are differentiated. And finally, very important, all these systems, which are internally differentiated, so there are multiple coming in, they're all correlated. So that's what you do with parametric modeling. You have this kind of dependency relations. One maps into the other. They're not there. They resonate there. And you can always do that. And the more you do it, the better. I mean, these heuristics can also tell you differentiate further with more range. When you have more, when the systems you want to correlate and make interdependent and with action, reaction, you can make, they don't have to be only the ones which are directly next to each other. You know, you're building response also to the fabric systems, objects far away, correlation. And that means in societal terms, everything communicates with everything else in a city, for instance. Because you programmatically, you locate your building here because you want to be close to and belong to many other things you should affiliate to and respond to. So so all systems correlate. So they're very condensed, 3 positives, 3 negatives, and that canonizes parametricism. And that's why I call them taboos and dogmas. Because in the end, we can kind of think it through why this makes sense. For instance, if you work with a sophisticated topology optimization tools or finite element analysis engineering, of course, every element is a parametric variable. Every system will be some kind of gradient graph, will never be an order of repetition. And of course, you would also correlate the subsystems. The modernism was all about separation, in German, Entflechtung. So you separate the systems so that they have nothing to do with each other, so that you can solve them independently because you had no idea how you would. You separate different parts of an institution, you separate them, you develop them independently, structure and facade, but also different parts and so on. There was, because you couldn't do better. And that's a way you can cope. And you do a structure, you isolate the elements and you actually cut redundancy, efficiency connections so that it is calculable, for instance. And that was, now, if you still do that, it's, of course, with the new capacities, looking back at this, it would be insane to do that. I mean, but still to do it. You know, it would be highly irrational because it is a false, old rationality, which has false, no economies, actually. They're anti-economic. So that's why in the end, these buildings would be the most light-footed, the cheapest, etc. as well. So you can see that the aesthetic values pick out the beneficial on many levels. social functionality, technical functionality, cost, environmental, light-footedness. And if you look at a building and it looks parametric design, okay, you can't guarantee it might be faked. So that's the problem. But you know, if you look at a minimalist building, it must be suboptimal. And you can at least say, this is a candidate. And I think we can. I think I've developed a sensibility where I can also see somebody's faking it. And you have to then learn through examples. You train yourself the sensibility that you can identify a tensile structure, which is properly optimized, a shell structure, etc. A topology visualization, the skeleton, so on. So you can, and in a sense, if I compare, so the transition is not only between steps, but the tectonism, there's 15 years of research with a lot of tools and techniques and so on, much more versatile and rich, is a big progress, and you can see that. And we should develop, I mean, it's still parametrism, it fits these abstract categories. You could go deeper and see the subtlety and the particulars which mark out tectonism also against older versions of parametricism. You should internalize that. And you should learn to love it. And of course, you need to learn to do it as well, which is harder, of course. But, you know, so that's at stake here. But I think so it is the epochal styles. So this style of hermeticism I've canonized is not my invention. I have rather been naming and canonizing a sustained and widespread architectural movement. This is really something you can't invent and calculate. It is evolved trial and error and retrospectively after this matures. So I have done this canonization by listing its most fundamental aesthetic values and by operationalizing these values into explicit formularistics, that is, instructions cast into the form of dogmas and taboos that must be adhered to in every design move. These formularistics have been paired up with explicit functionalistics, again, both positive commands and negative prohibitions. It is the epochal styles of architecture that in each socioeconomic epoch concretize the abstract concept of beauty via specific aesthetic regimes. Within each epochal style, further progress might take the form of subsidiary styles, further refining and adapting the prevalent architectural ideal of beauty. More recently, I've been naming and explicating the latest ideal of beauty I'm promoting, tectonism. The current phase of parametricism, a full book-length illustrated account of the subsidiary style and movement has been published last fall. So I recommend that. To conclude, it's very short. Beauty is a very deeply ingrained and indeed indispensable category for end users who must navigate the built environment aesthetically, for designers who cannot work but via aesthetic sensibilities, and for the discourse of architecture that must critically reflect and update these sensibilities and their underlying valuation criteria. That's it. Took a bit longer than I thought, but we have about 45 minutes or 40 minutes of question and answers.
Sure. Well, I think it's really intriguing lecture. Some pieces I have been read in even the articles, but there is more kind of comprehensive construction of serial beauty architecture. So it expands a lot, for example, the relationship between beauty and ornamentation is almost the motivation of the laser. That's really fascinating. But there are a lot of things I want to discuss, but I think I just put forward one question and then maybe later for audience. So In your theory, beauty is more kind of being looked at from an evolutionary perspective. Let's say beauty is historical constructive, in instance, but there's always been like or been like it's always evolved through the progress of society. But I'm just curious about there's a kind of a concept sublime from the aesthetic theory. Sublime is something you when you're being overwhelmed, the object is kind of having a distance from you and you feel those aesthetic values. But that's something for me is kind of more intrinsic to the object itself, rather you can be impulsed or you can be agitated. So how the concept of sublime falls into your category setting? My first question.
Well, it's kind of this idea of an awe-inspiring event, grand nature, etc., a big canyon or storm and so on. So it doesn't fit well. So I'm really on the fundamental binary, beneficial, detrimental. It doesn't allow much for the sublime stance, kind of a bit opposite. I know traditionally it has been discussed in aesthetic treatises, and also a lot of aesthetic, it's this idea of, in the sublime, you have this idea of an encounter with kind of in a painting or of a dangerous event in a safe environment or some kind of, I think it doesn't fit and it doesn't have to fit, right? And it's also often looked at in terms of, in the connection with art, painting, sculpture, maybe a theater. And this is not a theory of art. That's another topic. What contemporary art is and what the role of art is and the function of art and so on. So this is really aesthetic navigation, aesthetic values, attraction, repulsion in the world of, in the environment. These categories also exist in a lived environment, but it's not a kind of distant connoisseur relationship. It's more kind of an engaged in a life process, but then also in the design process for a life process. So yeah, it stands not, it doesn't fit. And I don't think it has to fit, because my own theory is not touching on these subtleties. Although I do find, let's say, there's other phrases one could, if you describe compositions and or values. I was toying around with the concept of elegance, for instance. But in the end, these are then become more specific, connected to a particular style or type of composition. This is more going in the realm of specifying particular ideals of beauty, sense of kind of, for instance, you have in modernism, you have the ponderated composition. You need language to describe what is important in since modernist beauty in terms of composition. You can have symmetry is not accepted usually, because it would be kind of, it's highly improbable that if you mirror something over, that this would be, you would need on this side exactly what you have on this side. It's probably already wrong. But so asymmetry becomes a kind of positive value, and symmetry is an indication that you're kind of formalist about it. And but for instance, you could say a ponderated composition where in modernism you often have you balance a composition. So you have a few elements and an asymmetric balance. You can say, why would I want to have that? The reason, I think, and you can find in the Bauhaus and Mies has had his students compose. If you make something very long here, you can make something tall here, or if you have a big lump here, you can counter it with a tall tower. So, and you could imagine this to be like a mobile, you hang it. Why does that make sense? And I think there is a rationality to this, because when you do modernist compositions like the Bauhaus, you have several components. You allow now to be different. The apartment building like this, the workshop like this, the administration like this, the ponderated composition, and you have much more degrees of freedom before you have to fit everything into a palace symmetrical proportion. But you could say, well, isn't it constrained? Do I need to? Yes, there is an advantage, because when you have the balanced composition, you can somehow sense what belongs together, and there's a sense of gravity. And if if they make kind of balanced ensemble, it unifies something which is at risk of falling apart, of not, particularly see the Bauhaus now with several other buildings built around it, and you look at the workshop and there's another rectangle to it and so on, you don't know where it belongs to. So anyway, so for instance, that's another point in case where I notice something like, why are they getting into these balanced composition? Why don't I just say whatever it comes together in asymmetric? And I think that's it. It has an advantage. Okay, it costs you because you have to then kind of, but there are many ways you can do the balancing. You can maybe you can try it. You just throw 5 things. You've optimized them. While you congregate them, you can congregate in a way that they make a balanced composition. So the constraint isn't that huge. The advantage is it gives you a sense of unity, and maybe then you can locate the center where you enter or where you gather. So that's my way of thinking. I give you another. And that is more like balance isn't always another word for beauty or something like this. Anyway, so sublime, no. But I want to give another example where you can see stylistic features and transitions, for instance, from the Renaissance to the Baroque. There's a new ideal of beauty. Why this is rational and functional. The number of things. So in the first thing to note, in Renaissance, there are simple buildings, one building by itself. And if you have, oftentimes they're smaller buildings. And they group them several buildings in a city or something. They don't have large building complexes. And when it comes to the Baroque, you have St. Peter, you have Versailles, the Palace of Versailles. You get much larger structured complexes. And what is happening here is that they have very complex symmetries. So that if you look at one half of Versailles, they're very asymmetric. So they become the asymmetry of the parts makes a stronger symmetry. They have things like colossal order, where you have the column over several stories. You have a lot of relief, huge cornices. So you have depths, and I say this is unifying a large, and they use curve. All these features make it possible to integrate into one legible whole many parts. So they use the asymmetry to bring them together in an overall symmetry. They use curvature, concave to tie together. They use, from a distant view, deep relief. so the social condition is, instead of a small city state, you have a kind of national country economy like France, or big kind of papal Catholicism. So you have deep relief, colossal order, complex symmetries. Why these features of Baroque are functional, and you, with the Renaissance aesthetic, you couldn't not create these large buildings that would fall apart, for instance. That's the kind of thinking of always trying to rationalizing, why is a Baroque happening? What's new, and why is that? Okay. Anyway, let's see some other questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick, for your inspiring lecture. So I'm coming at this topic from a practical point of view. And so in the past two decades, the advances of science and technology have definitely influenced the development of architecture, the theories and practices to a great extent. So through social media, the procedural elements of architectural design and construction are getting more exposed to public. I think on top of appreciating the final product, which is the building itself, people are also taking interest in the design and construction processes as well. So what do you think of this phenomenon, and what is your view of beauty in architectural design practices with an element of digital and intelligent technology?
I think that, first of all, I think the discipline, first of all, is in charge of articulating the built environment, right? And organizing societal process in the best way, and then also physically realizing, but also articulating and making it legible. But also, and then as things start to look in a certain way, we need to obviously have leadership qualities and be convincing, and hope that these, and the way I think the general public, of course, particularly when you have a new style, they will not be well adapted or wouldn't like it as of yet. So then you need leadership institutions, major important cultural institutions, major corporations who are trusted and they are heroes in society. If they start to pick up these new ways of architecture, I think that will then kind of find a lot of imitators, and people then, smaller companies, want to look like the great hero companies. They want to, so this will, you can't expect that the theoretical discourse, which we have as an expert discourse, where we have to debate that, is something that will not arrive in the general public. So, but the general public obviously has to buy into it in the end, but they will buy into it through different, by learning, by imitation, by recognition, by association, by, superficial fetishistic fashion, what becomes a fashion, and you have to do fad. That's the only way it will disseminate. You can't, it makes no sense. You have to rely on that. And that's, I think, the task. And obviously, the problem is at the moment that the discipline itself is fragmented. We have so many architects who, there's also a culture of debate where you say, well, I like this, I do my thing, and I have my own reasons. And you don't get enough challenge, peer challenge. We allow, we should be, it takes too long to, in a sense, make this more pervasive. Because I think it's somehow a shame that the bulk of the production of the built environment is still in this kind of old ways, wasteful and suboptimal in its functionality. But I think eventually when there's kind of leadership sort of field and leadership through important clients, you will have that become more generalized. It's also important for a city, the ensemble of buildings, because one of my big things, if you say everything resonates with everything else, things correlate, affiliate, respond to each other, announce each other. That's something which in the city we can't do as a single architect. We need to do this as a collective discipline. We need to have everybody, when you do in a district, that ethos and have the similar skillful ability to resonate, and there are 1,000 ways of doing this. So we don't have that at the moment. We can do a project like a Unicorn Island in Chengdu with 24 buildings. It's a small kind of mini district where we can try to do something which is quite diverse, which has an overall global order where things are legible and relate to each other and work with each other, etc. But that's not the city. So it was important for me. So with the general public, will follow the leadership of the discipline. We here who have insight, let's say Tongji, Philip Yuan, you, myself, and some others, we have to give leadership to the whole field. That's the initial task. And this takes a little bit too long. I think so. Sometimes, why is that so taking so long? And sometimes, the 2008 crisis was a big disruption. Maybe, in modernism, there was a Second World War, which delayed things for 10 years, 15 years. So, but that's the general public need to be guided. And in the end, they will also realize, wow, the best offices look like this, the best schools and universities look like this. So I don't want to go into this one anymore. Or if you go where you come to a place which, district should I? Also, it's the whole image of the city. There was this kind of fantastic thrill of, Le Corbusier in the modernist period, these kind of jammed and crammed historical cities, they were dysfunctional. They couldn't allow for cars. They were kind of not you were rejecting this, and you wanted to kind of the modernist was the good and real look. It's interesting when this kind of run its course and was no longer efficient because you had to re-urbanize and become this kind of network society, not greenfield, clean, separate living. We were thrilled, for instance, of something which was kind of in the interim kind of left over, like the chaos of Tokyo, or loving this kind of when you start injecting new things, collaging into old historic centers. So these sensibilities, where the vitality is, and you suddenly no longer like Brasilia or something sterile and monotonous. So people learn to like and change their sensibilities. And what cities, for instance, is a beautiful city. Beauty in a strange way, but Tokyo was a model, and not anymore. So yeah, I think that would be my answer. And of course, you have to use the new technologies you're talking about. If you use them properly for optimization, all these optimized forms, there's environmental engineering optimization, structural engineering optimization, but also people flow, what I'm a lot into, optimizing for social functionality and simulating occupancy and interaction processes. You don't end up with grids and platonic forms. But when you adapt, optimize into a complex site, which might have multiple levels, which might have multiple angles. You have to be very and yet you don't want deconstructivist chaos. There's certain tools you use, and the look and feel the best solution will look something like parameters tectonism. That doesn't mean that you can positively rely that this parameters project is well optimized. As I said, you could fake it, but which ones are not. And so we do need both. We do need critical analytic valuations, and we need the aesthetic sensibilities. We need both. And then the aesthetic sensibilities have to become the ideals of beauty of whole of society. So people select the right places and you know, and not withdraw into nostalgic villages where they miss the boat.
Difficulties, this problem of current obsessional diversity in all aspects of society. But I don't have problem with the cultural diversity or architectural style diversity, but from the global perspective, I think the problem is we don't have a dominant culture.
Yeah.
In architecture as well, we don't have the dominant series.
Yeah.
We could have one, but then we can have some subcategories, some cultural diversities.
Yeah.
But if we don't have those ones, then the society is falling apart and architecture is falling apart. So in terms of the leadership, it's really difficult.
So I believe, so I sometimes try to say, even for instance, our work, our Rosadi architects, if you spread out hundreds of projects, and there is an enormous diversity of morphology, of materiality. I mean, this world of pragmatism, particularly in tectonism, you don't only have NURB surfaces and blobs, you have, you know, curved folding, you have ruled surfaces, you have, you know, vaulting, block style vaulting, 3D printing versus also which leave traces in tectonics and so on. And tensile, you have so much morphologies, but they all share something. They're all parametric. So you have the endless forms of nature that could be in themselves much more. So the world of parametricism, or even Zardid architects, internally much more diverse than, for instance, the rest of production of architects. Put 100 architects, and they might be in different styles, and we have more diversity. So this. But there's something unity. That's why I think the recognizability, you think it's all the same. No, it's very diverse, but has recognizability through certain unity of principles. And we also have the principle of, you know, local adaptiveness to climate conditions. So we have our work in Middle East looks very different from the work in Europe, the work in the tropical areas. So we also want to learn deliberately from the vernaculars and adapting to local materialities and so on, and even local, to some extent, if there's still local patterns of social life, etc., courtyards, conditions. I'm not adverse to this, and so I do believe that this world of parametrics and tectonism generates unique identities and is highly diversified and locally adaptive, but not in a kind of foregrounded motifs and cliches, but more deeper inherent in because all the different, every new building has a new mix of programs. This museum is different from another because it's emphasizing more education, more outreach, or have research department and it's connected to this, whatever, university. So they all have their own uniqueness in terms of place, purpose, program. So I think more and more we have this kind of uniqueness, but the set of underlying principles could be unified. It's like the endless forms of nature. There's so many of them, but they're all, in a sense, parametrically malleable. They all have, you know, correlation. So this is kind of, and that's what would be my answer to say, well, you want to unify, homogenize, and oh, well, no, I want to have a unity of principles, which then allows a much enlarged diversity of expression. And tectonism, I'm emphasizing, is much more diverse in its expressive communicative capacities than older forms of parametricism. So that would be so it wouldn't be a loss to have, to instance, stop minimalism, stop, and sometimes within parametricism, when you have no good reason to differentiate. Because, you know, in details, we often are kind of minimalist. We want to make it as simple as possible relative to the complexities of program differentiation site. We don't artificially overcomplicate. But we also realize if you do a big campus like Google with many buildings and so on, and if you even just kind of older parametricism projects where you reuse blobs 50 times, even if they're all different, it becomes too homogeneous. So then you use tectonics and you need shells and tensor, and you need timber grid shells and active bending and catenaries, and they all harmonize. They all see, oh, this belongs together, but they're also different at the same time, and they can connect and respond to each other. So that's the word, highly differentiated, and you couldn't, there's no other way than to deliver this. So if I did this experiment, it looked, and at the number of Google campus, and they're so large that, and I had different projects, one based on catenary, one on active bending, one on, they all started to look homogeneous, even though there wasn't a single repetition. There was, this kind of richness of articulation, differentiation is important to recognize and differentiate these pieces, but also see how they connect, and degrees of connection, degrees of similarity, a network of similitudes. And so that's this kind of a new way of quasi-ornamentation, the semiological project, the way I want to use, that's a big theme of my book, Tectonism. These are not only technologically well adapted, but they're also highly expressive and recognizable. So you have the whole families of structures, and you can have vast and small and flat and more steep tensile structures. They all connect as tensors, and you can connect them with shells and so on and so forth. And then you hybridize them. So that's my thing, that this richness of diversity, and I do find it stunning when we can fill a whole museum with buildings, and you can say, well, put next to this, and that in terms of diversity, 50 years of modernism, all modernism which was produced by all architects around the world in one room, and then and say, this is 200 buildings, this is 200 buildings, where there's more diversity. And that includes, even if you have, this evolved over 50 years from white modernism with some kind of brutalism, concrete, and then into some kind of high tech and Mies and so, but still, there's more diversity. And similarly, you could say within Corbusier, compared to previous periods, the oeuvre of Le Corbusier is more internally diverse than 300 years of classical architecture. Everything, European architecture. So it increases. Anyway, but this kind of diversity, which is just coming through this fragmentation into different styles, is not really adding that much. Because you get a lot of sameness. And that's why I say, when you look at this, the big problem is cities now, I call it garbage spill urbanization. Because you have a lot of difference, tall and this and that and curved and angular, and everything is kind of randomly and different styles. There's a kind of neoclassical thing, and then there's a kind of minimalist thing, and then there's a kind of whatever, hermetism or pseudo-hermetism, and you're all thrown in. That just generates disorder and visual chaos, and you cannot get any clues. And so that is kind of bad diversity and also less diversity. But there's also the good diversity and bad diversity.
Thank you for the lecture. It's very informative. I'm also interested in the topic of the concept of beauty. And I agree that the dilemma that this concept is bursting, or is a modern phenomenon. Because Heidegger has argued that the works of art is not only related to aesthetics, but also refers to truths. And as far as I know, no matter in ancient China or in ancient Greece, many famous philosophers like Confucius, Plato, and Aristotle also, they both believe that the concept of beauty is closely connected to the concept of virtue and goodness. I'm reading Aristotle's politics. And his politics not only provide us with actual and practical techniques for us to write a very beautiful drama or tragedy, but also he refers to or points to our aim of life, a collective life in ancient Greece. And he believed that the aim of tragedy should provide us with the meaning of our life. But this connection, the connection between the concept of beauty and virtue has been separated with each other in modern times. Like Baudelaire, a very famous poet, he believed that things that are evil can also be considered as beautiful. And I personally believe that this idea is kind of horrible to us. So I truly believe that the true progress in the future should be a interrelated world. We should pursue a very a whole world, not only relating to our inner world and the outer world, but also points to our social life, our personal life, and the various functions of our built environments. Furthermore, I personally believe that there should be several irreducible and constant aspects for the concept of beauty, as this is the foundation for our communication with each other, and this word should be alive and should be alive in our language, no matter in our current life or in our future life. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the comment. I mean, I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned. It's true that in ancient Greek philosophy and traditionally, the good and beautiful are connected strongly. This gives us the hint that both the concept of good and beautiful are connected to the beneficial. But I think the certain differentiation is also justified. So the way this, because when goodness, if you just say have a yes, no, attracted, repulsive, any aspect of the thing, you're just attracted or repulsed, then this kind of, let's say, goodness in terms of moral judgment and aesthetic judgment isn't yet differentiated. It's just, I'm drawn to this place or person, or I'm pulled away from this place or person. So they're close together. The differentiation makes sense because in the end, when now we're thinking about, let's say, moral qualities, it attaches to behavior of people, and let's say also maybe character traits, maybe groups, not so easy to cities, and beautiful to the outward. So good for me, or, to be with this person, beautiful, powerful, I can see, or goodness. And the differentiation makes sense, but there's a strong parallel. So moral sensibilities, they keep changing. What is an attractive behavior, a person you should like, want to be close to, changes historically, but it's a bit different from outward appearance. And the moral sensibility doesn't so much attach to things. It's more attached to human beings and their behavior, maybe groups potentially. So that's one differentiation. but they're also very similar in terms of, because when we appreciate certain character trait, a virtue, we should appreciate and just describe as virtuous behaviors which are actually beneficial for society. You know, and these things also change. So the moral sensibilities, some fundamental things, you know, you could trust a person, you know, prohibitions against lying, against kind of physical violence, clear. But there are many moral sensibilities which have dramatically changed also. And the modern moral sensibilities are quite different, similar to aesthetic sensibilities. Moral sensibilities also evolve because certain character traits and modes of behavior are less viable, less functional, and become maybe even dysfunctional. For instance, a very, very strong tribal loyalty and prevalence, in-group, out-group, is typical for traditional, where you don't have to recognize a stranger as even as a human being, right? For instance, and you very, very strong difference you make between inside and outside. It's difficult in a multi-global world, or you know, let's say you find it very strong here, where you have the certain tensions building up. You know, for instance, loyalty, and I do something for you, and you do something for me, and you can rely on friends, you get privileges and you get better treatment. Now, this gets into conflict in a very kind of professionalized world where loyalty nearly becomes corruption. And you cannot call on this anymore. You might be friends, and in certain domains you can be loyal, but when it comes to promotions or, you know, many other aspects of contemporary life, you have to kind of stay away from loyalty. You cannot call in claims of loyalty. And so these are things. So, and how, and, you know, filial, you subject yourself to the vicious and instructions and guidance of your parents. If that would be still there, as strong as in a society which anyway is kind of highly stable and reproducing, where the son picks up the same profession and so on and so forth, these things become dysfunctional. So insisting on them becomes problematic. So you have to revolutionize moral sensibilities. And but they also become, you have to really learn emotionally also. They're motivating, and you recognize what's good, and you get kind of quite emotionally strong about this. And you have to overcome that and relearn and revolutionize that. And that's what you have happening. That's why you need TV series to learn how one lives as a mature urbanite. And, you know, you have all these tensions between the generations, and they don't understand each other. They have, you know, so this is similar, very parallel, but distinct. So what is parallel is the root, this kind of equation, the good is the beautiful, is the similar kind of the beautiful is the beneficial. And this undifferentiated, but now, and they run parallel. And you can make a theory of moral sensibilities very similar to my theory of evolutionary and adaptation and progress and relearning and so on and so forth. And they're also very intuitive, they're emotionally invested. There's very, very parallel, but they're distinct. So I wouldn't as we cannot have that close association which used to be in the classical, where, you know, where the villain looks physically ugly and a beautiful looking person can't be the crook, you know. No, they can't. And an ugly person could be highly kind of, you know, morally, you know, sophisticated and reliable. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think your lecture is very interesting, and I would like to start like your perspective of beauty. So you mentioned the history of ornament, and some artists, when they do their like arts, they don't do much research. So we can define this kind of beautiful works as a personal taste. Another instance would like someone may not like Zaha's buildings, but they don't feel it's kind of just a graphic design. Because they can figure out the like forms and the outlook of buildings, the interior floating space are all based on like mathematics and precise calculations. So I think the big point here, the difference between these kind of personal taste, yeah, they still may not like these Zaha's buildings. So the big point here is the difference between these kind of personal taste and the we say this aesthetic judgment, so we call it beauty. Is we check the works, the beautiful works, if it is logical or rational or not. So here comes my question. We all know that you have done a lot of terrific works in the field of like the AI generation, image generation and image generation, like to convert these text to the image and the videos, right? So there actually exists a kind of black box here of this technology. Just like the neural network, right? So this kind of like the inner system is not like the ancient Greece or ancient Rome's buildings. They have very clear structure and the buildings are transparent. We can tell this is very like it's kind of a system, but this kind of black holes, right? Actually, it has a very vital point. You also mentioned that this kind of this reaction system here, because when we want to make the outcomes, it will be like what we want it to be. We can optimize, make iterations and check the outcomes and optimize the keywords, right? So how do you think this kind of not clear things is a big challenge of your beauty here, or you just see it as take it as a technique issue, which is need to be solved out in the future? Thank you.
Okay, first of all, personal taste. You can't deny that people have different tastes to some extent. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't overemphasize that. That might be, but it's something one should critically reflect upon. And if somebody says, well, I don't like these buildings, I mean, I'm not saying that our buildings are perfect. And it only depends on the mature examples through which you hone and shape your taste. But the personal taste might be a problem, and you should work on this and learn to like the things which are good for you and good for society. But also there might be your place in society might be such that, you know, to some extent, you don't have the same requirements of identifying, you know, these kind of buildings as the most functional for you. So I allow for that. I said earlier, there's a certain differentiation in society. But the purely personal taste is, you know, of course, we all shape our experiences, which are partly random and partly systematic. Probably there are no very, very idiosyncratic and personal tastes. And maybe they are, you know, and you shape your life maybe around those tastes, you can still find a reasonably good life. But if you allow this to shape you too much, uncritically, you're not in tune with the times. So you've acquired, for some reason, through some kind of backward and dysfunctional tastes. That could become a problem. Now, AI. So that is about personal taste. It's not something we can be happily settling with and say, well, that's who I am. I can't do any other. Then you might hurt yourself through your taste, you know. when it comes to your, career development, your productivity, or the relationships you build, the places you end up going to. They might, in the end, kind of you live beyond your opportunities. You don't flourish to the full extent of your possibilities. You don't make full use of society, for instance, by not liking the right place, and not being attracted by the right kind of environments and groups and so on. There's also moral sensibilities equally. I mean, in real life for us, this moral sensibilities play a big role as well. The kind of people you like and the kind of groups you want to be participating in, which you from what you've kind of so far evolved as your sensibilities. AI, okay, so AI really relies on the rationality of the learnings, data sets, and sample sets, right? And it's interesting. On one hand, you can say for some reason in Midjourney, I mean, if you Google AI architecture, it's largely parametricism, which has to do with so it has the right look and feel. Oftentimes, with maybe the age group, and maybe it's some inbuilt bias in Midjourney, or I don't know, because you hybridize with organic forms, etc. So that's for me encouraging, because it means that parameterism is spreading and coming. Same with the metaverse. Now, but again, the actual so you generate something which looks in overall general kind of terms as something which could be a right solution, but you can trust these solutions so easily because of your image. So this is kind of faking it oftentimes. So we work with it and we kind of pre-constrain it, or we just get the idea of certain moves and certain mediations when different parts are nicely intricately connected in a new way. But then we can literally really take that outcome and stuff our program into this thing. That will obviously not work. So we have to really be, and that's why in the actual design process, we always iterate and back and forth between these kind of analytic, calculated, and then kind of aesthetic control, expressive control, which also controls, for instance, for legibility, for easy recognizability, etc., as well as so we are pure image based design is not going to the right solution, and I also find the majority of these results in fact ugly, because I have higher demands and more evolved sense of beauty, where I think there's I find it inspirational and there's a creativity boost. But taking these things as they are, maybe they're beautiful, but as some of them, not the majority. The majority is pretty ugly still, even though it has the right stylistic idiom. But you couldn't obviously take them because they're not constrained by the particulars of the project. But you can take certain ideas of it. And some I can lift up and say, this is a beautiful design, but unfortunately I don't have the right site, the right program for it. So it's this aspect where in the end it's never aesthetic only judgment as a design. It's always also the slow and fast thinking together. And the image AI isn't, but also it has to, you can't do tectonism properly with AI yet, because that has higher rationality constraint, higher coherency demands, which you don't get yet, but it doesn't mean you couldn't. So I see something where you can do a lot more with AI by training it on tectonism results and demanding that it not only get perspective, light and shadow, and gravity right, but also structural logics, certain geometry. You can tell it, make a tensor structure, make a shell structure, make multiple intersecting, and getting that right with the degree of subtlety. I don't exclude that. And then you also input at the same time the organizational requirements and quantitative. Maybe, I mean, it's a balance. So I don't think I think you can definitely in the end use it, but not at the moment that it would meet the requirements. And even then, as you said, these other constraints, they're not images only. They're kind of logical other tools you bring in. So it's not going to be an aesthetic only, but an important, and I think indispensable aspect of our discipline. Are we running out of time? Maybe that's a good way
I think we
to stop. Thank you. Thank you.
Later, around here. So thank you.
Recording stopped.
Thank you.